first ever POLIMP webinar, which is going to be #1 in a series of 8, which we will be producing throughout the next 12 months. My name is Matthias Duwe. I'm head of the climate team at Ecologic Institute, which is one of the partners in the POLIMP project. It's a project funded by the European Union's 7th Framework Program on Research, Technological Development and Demonstration. We bring together a total of 7 European research organizations. Let me tell you a little bit about POLIMP before I talk about our topic today, our speakers, and our setup, very briefly. POLIMP's main mission was to identify knowledge gaps in EU and international climate policy for our target audience, the decision makers. We developed a set of tools to try and collect existing information on climate policy, both at the EU and the international level, and to try and present that again in a format that will be more easily accessible and understandable. And so there are several tools that we have developed in this regard, and the key one of those is in fact an online website called a knowledge platform, which is known as Climate Policy Info Hub. It's also very important, that's also the name of the website, climatepolicyinfohub.eu, which you're all very welcome to check out. We are adding new material to it on a regular basis, and so that was the first of our online tools for information dissemination. The second one is in fact the webinar series that we are starting today. And this will allow us to zoom in on different topics and discuss them in a topic that's hopefully both informative and entertaining and engaging. We are connecting that with input from a series of experts around Europe, which we are tapping the brains of through the means of SNAP surveys. These were just conducted for the very first time last week. Our expert response group responded to the survey, and we will have some of their opinions and so survey results to be feeding into the conversation today. The results will be going live from that whole survey later today on the project website polimp.eu. But back to our topic for today. It seemed very natural that we start this off in the year 2015 with something that's focused on the international climate negotiation. And so the specific topic that we chose to start was, what are the lessons that can be drawn for the Paris 2015 negotiations process from the experience of the process leading up to the Copenhagen conference in 2009? And to discuss a set of questions around this more general theme, I am privileged to have with me today 2 distinct expert speakers to discuss this topic with, who have both been following the international climate talks for many years. We have Dr. Sebastian Oberthür, who is Professor for Environment and Sustainable Development at the Institute of European Studies at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Thank you, Sebastian. And we have Dr. Wytze van Gaast, who is with Joint Implementation Network, a key POLIMP project partner, in fact, our coordinating organization. Thanks to both of you for being here. And on a technical note, this is the very first of our webinars. We have been facing a couple of technical challenges, which means that we only have one of our speakers present with a live video feed, but we hope to address that the second time around. Before we start off with the first question, though, 2 more words on the technical setup. We are using here a system, as all of those of you that are participating live will know, that is called Google Hangouts on Air, which has interesting features that we are hoping to put to some good use in this format. So one of these is the Q&A function. So you can actually, those that are watching live, pose questions. We have received some already in advance in writing, and we've listed those in the system. For those of you who are watching live, you can actually express your preference on questions that I should be asking to our 2 experts, and so you can vote these questions up or down. And I see the first votes are coming in already. and it will be, of course, up to me to take these on or utterly ignore them. And then, for those of you that are watching the recording, when a question is being asked, we have the possibility of setting a bookmark, and so you'll be able to jump ahead to that question in the recording. Hopefully, people will find that useful. So, enough on the technicalities. Let's get on with the substance. By way of a few framing words, it seems rather obvious, an obvious parallel to draw. We are in July of 2015 now. We're 6 months away from Paris. And 6 years ago, there was a similar process running up to a big conference in Copenhagen. This was, and I think still is, the largest ever gathering on climate change, political gathering, and it received unprecedented public attention. It also certainly had the highest density ever of heads of state and government coming together on the topic, and the expectations were immense. It was to deliver the specifics of what the international community was going to agree to do after the end of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, so after 2012. As you are all aware that are watching this live or in the recording, there is no direct Copenhagen Treaty of sorts, no Copenhagen Agreement that we can link to that conference. The accord that was produced and drafted then was not formally adopted by the conference, and the meeting itself ended in some controversy. So, by way of segueing to my first question, let me actually show you something that what our experts said on this very topic of Copenhagen v. Paris. They were quite unequivocal about the fact that they saw Copenhagen COP15 having been a failure in terms of what it set out to do. We also asked our roster of experts, how likely do you think it is that we will be getting some form of an agreement, whatever its actual form or content, in Paris? And they were giving us a very high likelihood of a Paris agreement being achieved. So when I saw those results, I was wondering, is it actually a fair comparison to make, to be having Copenhagen face off in this way with Paris? And so this is the first question that I would like for Sebastian and Wytze to deal with. Are these two conferences really, were they or are they trying to achieve the same or similar things? Sebastian, what's your take?
Well, thanks very much. Perhaps I should get rid of my earphones because I have an echo. So I hope you can hear me. Perhaps in a way, obviously, they are trying to do the same thing. They are trying, both trying to get a global agreement. But obviously, there are also important differences. First of all, very formally, Copenhagen was essentially about the time until 2020, and now it's about the time after 2020. So most of the mitigation commitments or INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions, aim at 2025, 2030. And there are other differences. I think very clearly this kind of global agreement and prior to Copenhagen was a very contested goal. It was primarily the EU that wanted to have a global treaty, whereas prior to Paris the situation, I think, looks much more in favor of such a global treaty. We now have still the EU in favor of a global treaty. We have also the US essentially being on board, and most recently then also China expressing its support for a global treaty as part of the deal in Paris, because there are supposed to be also other elements, probably just COP decisions. What's certainly different is also that there are much more modest expectations towards Paris than there were towards Copenhagen, and these expectations are much closer when you compare the different parties, I would say. So the range of options being considered and being contested is narrower than before Copenhagen, and that may be then also the reason why you have a high likelihood in your survey of people thinking there will be something in Paris. So there's much more common ground, especially as regards the outcome. Let me make two more points, perhaps, and then Wytze can come in. In Copenhagen, one of the issues was, as you said, what happens after the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol? And that involved the question also what happens with the Kyoto Protocol. And that was very much an issue of discussion. And that has in the meantime been roughly clarified. We have the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol agreed until 2020, and it's clear to everybody that afterwards this new global treaty would kick in. And secondly, and perhaps not least, Paris comes after Copenhagen. So it's no parallelism in that sense. Countries simply, many of the representatives realize that they can't have Copenhagen again, because that would be a disaster. And that may be the other reason why people feel that Paris will not be Copenhagen again. Obviously, many more things have changed in between, politics, etc., but I guess we will touch upon that later on. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sebastian. So, Wytze, you know, this is the last point was very specific. Do you agree that Copenhagen, to some extent, is enabling Paris?
Yeah, yes, I think that's a very good point to make. That the world cannot have such a failure again, and so we need to achieve something. And I think also what Sebastian said is correct, that it's probably much easier now to achieve a deal in Paris, because the expectations are lower, and the bar, I think, is also placed on a lower level. I think if you look at Paris and Copenhagen, then you can also see a nice development in the negotiations. Copenhagen was really about extending Kyoto. Kyoto had its first commitment period from 2008 to 2012, and the urgency in Copenhagen was really about how can we achieve a quick agreement on the next commitment period, which will smoothly move from 2012 into a second commitment period in 2013 or shortly thereafter. And so a lot of discussion, most of discussion before Copenhagen was about continuation of the Kyoto Protocol, and also realizing that between 2009 and 2012 there were only 3 years left. And if we remember the time it took to have the Kyoto Protocol entered into force after its agreement in 1997, it took almost 8 years. So the time was already very short between 2009 and 2012. So the urgency, the negotiation urgency, was really about how can we close a quick agreement on a second commitment period for Kyoto, so that enough parties can ratify the new treaty on time, so that we can move on with the Kyoto Protocol after 2012, with the horizon in 2020. And I think then that put so much pressure on the process, because allowing an agreement on such a second commitment period agreement would also brought into the picture the urgency to bring the USA back on board of the Kyoto Protocol, because a second commitment period without the USA on board was not acceptable. That was at least the feeling during the negotiations, and it also brought to the fore the urgency to bring rapidly growing developing countries on board, such as China and Brazil, India, Mexico, South Korea. And also all these urgencies came together, and that put a very high pressure on the Copenhagen negotiations, and which eventually resulted in its failure. It could simply not be achieved, all those urgencies at the same time within such a short preparation time. I think in Paris there's another urgency, but it's much more about the climate itself, we have a much stronger scientific consensus on the risks of what will happen if the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere becomes too high. What are the risks of global warming for global ecosystems? And there is also a political goal now based on scientific insights, a 2 degrees Celsius goal, which was adopted after Copenhagen. And I think there's also much less focus in Paris on legally binding quantified commitments as we had in Copenhagen. So the focus is now much more on what will countries do to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions. And that calls for both developed and developing country partners. And therefore, Paris can become, in my view, much more easily become a success, because the pressure is high, is less high than in Paris to achieve a legally binding set of commitments, and more countries are willing and have already announced that they will do something to mitigate their emissions.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting point that you're picking up on. I think I would still like to ask sort of both of you whether, in summary, this means that Paris is really just giving itself sort of a much easier mission to achieve if kind of the expectations are significantly lower. But this would be, I think, taking your points and condensing them too much. I have a specific follow-up there. I think, Wytze, you were getting into, there are a couple of other factors in terms of the general context that are changing. You mentioned a few of those. The last one was the one on increased scientific understanding. Which of those external factors, I think you earlier, Sebastian, alluded to a growing consensus or willingness to engage in adopting something at the international level. Which of those factors do you think have changed most significantly in terms of enabling a positive outcome from Paris? Is it sort of public attention? Is it differences in national policy development? Is it technological advances? Is it the science?
Whom are you asking?
Wytze, sorry. Could you continue on from your answer with that specific focus? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think there are several differences in terms of context, but I think to name three at this stage, I think the biggest context change is that after Copenhagen, it does no longer seem to be a taboo to say that developing countries will undertake mitigation actions. And that was a big hurdle during the negotiations before Copenhagen. So I think the fact that in Cancun it was agreed that developing countries and developed countries will undertake mitigation actions is an important context changer. I think another change is in terms of context is that negotiations are often determined by tactics, the game changers, such as before Copenhagen there was the documentary by Al Gore, and there was the Nobel Peace Prize for the IPCC and Al Gore for their work to visualize the possible effects of climate change. But that was all outside the negotiation context. And I think now within the negotiation context we have seen an important game changer that may have been the agreement last year between President Xi and President Obama to specify the responsibility of China and the USA in a future climate regime. So I think that has been a very important game changer because many people refer to it, and it seems to be that now countries know that if these two giants become serious, we cannot not stay behind. And the third,
if I may check it, so does that mean that you think that, for example, An Inconvenient Truth and the IPCC Nobel Prize in 2007, that those things were made less of an impact than, say, the agreement between the US and China of last year for Paris?
I think the Gore documentary and the Nobel Peace Prize were very important to raise public awareness, and that's what I could see from my own professional experience. That all of a sudden I was asked by people who were non-climate experts to deliver a presentation for their group in the evening to tell them about climate change. So the public awareness became much bigger. But I don't think that really changed the negotiations itself. And I think the agreement between President Xi and President Obama last year was much closer to the negotiations, because those were really the most important countries in terms of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions, who said that they agreed on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by a certain timetable, which was quite unique, especially from the perspective of China. So I think that has been much more important for the negotiations than Al Gore's documentary and the IPCC Nobel Peace Prize, because that was really for the public awareness. And I think in light of that, I think the third very important context factor has been the actual submission of China's INDC, intended nationally determined contribution, towards the Paris, because now it really shows that whether it is close to business as usual, or whether it is not sufficiently ambitious, as some observers have said, it is a very concrete first plan to do something. And as some observer wrote on the internet 2 days ago, if China promises something, if China will only present something that they know they can fulfill. And I think that's a very important context factor also.
Thank you. Sebastian, sort of what do you think? Do you agree? Is it sort of, are the types of milestone pre-Paris agreements that we're seeing a bigger deal in terms of enabling a Paris agreement than what we had in 2007?
Right. Perhaps let me make a couple of comments. I think we have seen actually between Copenhagen and today, pre-Paris, we've seen quite a change of context, actually not only to the positive side. If you think of the whole financial and economic crisis that has unfolded, especially in Europe, that has certainly not necessarily helped. So that's also context that has changed. But several other things have changed to the positive, I think. I believe that part of the background, if not reason, for the deal, for the joint announcement by China and the US last year, is that perhaps the geopolitical situation has become a little bit clearer for those big powers, namely that they are the two big powers. There has been enormous progress when you look at the analyses of national policies being implemented across the world to address climate change. So that's certainly a positive development, that certainly countries have learned in the meantime how to implement these measures, that they can actually work, etc., etc. And not least also technology has made enormous advances. If we look at the diffusion of renewable energy technologies and their diffusion across the world, that now the biggest market for those is China for wind and solar, that the prices have come down. All these factors obviously matter. Let me make two further remarks, perhaps. First, on your previous question, like, is Paris therefore easy? No, it's not at all easy, but that's also not what you asked. I guess you asked, is it the same as Copenhagen? No, it's not the same. But I think it cannot at all be taken for granted, even though your survey said there's a high likelihood of some kind of agreement, that there will be a meaningful treaty at the end of the year. We are just in the middle of a very difficult process still, that is not clearly on its path, as far as I can see, towards that kind of treaty that will set the stage for the future in this field. There's a number of challenges and we could explore them, but I agree that the kind of political context with the US-China declaration, but think also of the G7 declaration that was adopted just a couple of weeks ago in Schloss Elmau. That certainly shows that there is movement around the globe. When before has the G7 talked about decarbonization in the course of this century? That's an enormous development, especially when you think about who's at the table. That includes Japan, that includes Canada, that they have made that a statement that shows that there is discussion and movement among leaders. Although again, compared to Copenhagen, I think the involvement of leaders at this stage is much more limited than it was before Copenhagen, or I should rather say not involvement, but attention. And we'll have to see how that evolves towards Paris, with, as I said, the financial and economic crisis in Europe, for example, playing a big role there.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I wanted to also share with you and with our viewers very briefly what our experts answered on this question in terms of where they saw the key external factors, and I think they came out with similar results as to where you were putting a focus. So if I'm taking in particular the kind of agreement that was possible now between the US and China as part of there being progress in national climate related policies, and Sebastian, you in particular were focusing on the importance of renewable energy technology having improved in both cost and in terms of actual deployment and share in the energy mix, then those are also the two factors that came out highest in the survey as factors that have an impact. A lot of the other points that were raised also came out higher, and but lower compared to these first two, which are sort of the key points from the expert survey. One point that comes out somewhat stronger here is the increased societal awareness, and I just want to check that back with you, whether you think sort of this is an issue that has a significant impact on the likelihood of Paris being able to come up with an agreement. And could I ask Sebastian first, please?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the graph, which is interesting to see. Can you hear me? Because I don't have an echo now. Okay, great. I guess if I look at it from a European perspective, I'm wondering where the increased societal awareness comes from, because the other summit was also in Copenhagen, and as we know, there was a lot of societal awareness, at least in Europe, in the Copenhagen year. Perhaps if one looks at it more internationally, that would seem to make sense to me, because I have the feeling that there's much more societal awareness in other parts of the world. For Europe, I'm not sure. Then I would kind of say let's have a study that investigates that, whether this is a perception or whether this is real. But I can imagine if we look a little bit more broadly, and not only at Europe, that increased societal awareness indeed could be a point.
Thank you. Wytze, I actually suggest to be moving on with you on a question that is moving away again from this graph and the external factors, but is more talking about the things that are different again for Paris, many of which you already referred to. Which of the things would you consider are actual elements that have been done differently in terms of process or setup that you could say are actual lessons from the Copenhagen experience? And I would think there are a couple of the points that you mentioned before, such as the INDCs play in this role, but what's your take?
I think a very important difference that I see is that the current negotiations are not only about numbers, or not only about figures, because that was always a bit of criticism you could have on the Kyoto Protocol, that countries back in 1997 negotiated percentages assigned to mount units, and that was done mainly by pure negotiations. So I do 5% and you do 4%, and then you can do 7% reduction. And those were targets agreed around the negotiation table for a period of time, 15 years in the future. Nobody precisely knew what the economy would look like by then. Nobody precisely knew what the costs of those policies, of achieving those percentages would amount to. And that has always been a problem with the Kyoto Protocol. And what you could also see is that without a strict compliance regime, by the time countries realize that complying with those percentages becomes costly or difficult, they simply do not comply. And I think that has been an important lesson for the current negotiations towards Paris. Because in Copenhagen, it was still a lot about numbers, and it failed. And nowadays, during the past 6 years, we see that climate mitigation and also adaptation measures are much more discussed in light of countries' national economic, environmental, and social planning. If you look at, for example, the NAMAs and also the INDCs, of course, and the technology needs assessment process that was done in 36 developing countries, you see that options for mitigation and adaptation are chosen, prioritized in light of countries' development planning. And that makes it, of course, much more easy to adopt climate measures, because even if you do not do it primarily for climate, especially in developing countries, it would still support countries in achieving their longer-term climate or development goals, such as energy poverty alleviation, or prevention of flooding, or making your agricultural sector more resilient, those things. So I think the move after Copenhagen to link and embed climate measures more closely into national economic, social, environmental development planning is a big difference and an important lesson learned after Copenhagen.
Thank you. Sebastian, do you agree?
Well, there's one issue that I would take issue with, and that is that Kyoto kind of was a deal where it was only about percentages, and if countries realized that it was actually expensive to implement it, they would just not comply. I think there's exactly one country where that has happened, and that is Canada, to name it. And the other parties to the Kyoto Protocol have actually implemented measures and have complied with the protocol. Although, if you think back to the mid-1990s when these figures were negotiated, people were saying, cheap talk by the Europeans, they will not get to the -8%, but they did. So I'm not so sure, but where I agree is that that there's a new approach that is just also occurring because we're now, differently from Kyoto, we are not talking only about the industrialized countries, but we're talking about everybody, and in developing countries it makes good sense, as Wytze said, to integrate climate policies into development planning, etc., and approach the issue from that angle. So it's a different approach that's being built. That is, I think, also one of the reasons why it's taking long and is rather difficult, because it's different. It's not just, okay, we take Kyoto and we expand it to the world and then we'll see how it works. No, it's Kyoto apparently is not acceptable. I don't know whether it would work, but it's at least not acceptable to just be to be expanded and brought to the rest of the world. But it's a softer approach that is now being tried, that is perhaps more facilitative, that is more trying to encourage countries to take action. And what that brings with it, I think that global approach is at the same time one of the big issues in the negotiations. That is, how do we deal with the question of differentiation, which was less problematic in the Kyoto context when that was only about industrialized countries, and now it's about the whole world. So who needs to do how much, and are we all the same, or are the differences among us, and how should they be expressed and reflected? Yeah, let me end here.
Mm-hmm. If I were to take a more negative or pessimistic perspective, then I could summarize the development that you were both describing as one where, for political feasibility and acceptance reasons, the process has been changed in a way in that the types of actions that countries put forward and commit themselves to under the future agreement is very closely linked to their own national interests. And this may be what's necessary, but taking the pessimistic perspective, taking that to a conclusion, one could say we are now therefore facing a much greater difficulty, or are we facing a trade-off with ensuring that this bottom-up national targets-based approach is actually sufficient for what we are having to do on a global scale. Do you see that trade-off also? Was it inevitable that this would happen, and how do you think it could be addressed? Sebastian, could you start?
Yeah, I think I would in principle agree with what you said, that there is we now have essentially a bottom-up process, which in my view is bound to, and perhaps hopefully also designed to, in the end, show that it will not deliver itself the sufficient result. I think that's what the first analyses also show of the INDCs that have been submitted by countries, that the level of ambition is probably insufficient to bring us to a pathway that is compatible with 2 degrees target. So how to address then that situation is, that's at least the thinking of many people, that agreement would be, the Paris Agreement would be designed in a way that it would be very flexible and would allow for what's then sometimes called ratcheting up, but not ratcheting down, so kind of increasing ambition over time as countries learn that they have to move up, and that is built into the system, so that we don't need to come back every 5 years and negotiate for another 5 years to get to the next stage, but that we can come back every 5 years and can negotiate perhaps for 1 or 2 years to have something that then is agreed relatively quickly, and where the direction is very clear, so that the direction is upwards. I think another point perhaps to be made in that context is, that's also something I have personally learned, if that is the right expression, over the past 5-6 years since Copenhagen, is that this international process is important, but it's only one of several games that are being played, one of several shows in town, and this kind of international process interacts with other levels of action and other actors. And that's perhaps where the added value then also comes. It's not only about the numbers and bottom-up process, but also about the signal that this conference and this process sends to actors in society, to business, to pension funds, etc., that the world is moving towards decarbonization, and that therefore the respective, for example, business strategies should be adapted to that. And that's, I think, where some of the hope comes from, that this bottom-up process will nevertheless reinforce a dynamic that will then lead to a scenario that could be compatible with the 2 degrees target.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Wytze, what is your take?
I totally agree with Sebastian's point. I think also in comparison to Copenhagen, in terms of perception, Paris will not be the end game. It will be an important milestone towards a low emission, climate resilient future, and I think that's also what we need to realize, that unfortunately, given the urgency, unfortunately, changing societies, economies in low emission, climate resilient societies takes a lot of time, and it will also be costly in many countries, and so there's no. That's also perhaps one of the observations you can make when looking at several of the INDCs that have been presented to the Secretariat by countries, is that they are still very often about, this is our business as usual scenario, and we will reduce 20% below business as usual. But you do not see an underlying analysis of the country sectors and the systems that need to be changed in order to achieve those 10 or 20% reductions below business as usual. And you can also notice that especially developing countries are a bit reluctant to be too ambitious, because they may realize that some of the mitigation targets that they include in their INDCs, they simply cannot afford those issues without external support. And perhaps that could be one of the main challenges of the ongoing negotiations, including Paris, is that by 2020 we will have, if everything goes well, we will have $100 billion per year available under the supervision of the Green Climate Fund, and somehow that money needs to be spent, and it's very difficult at the moment to allocate this money, to say we're going to give this amount of million to this country for this particular task. And so I think an important challenge in towards Paris, but also after Paris, will be to help countries to identify climate measures which go beyond their business as usual scenarios, and which also help them change the systems towards low carbon and climate resilient societies, and to enable them obtain financial capacity and technological support for those changes from the Green Climate Fund, from the climate, from the technology mechanism, and from the training programs out there under the convention, but also under the supervision of the multilateral development banks. So it will take time, and it's a complex process, and it requires rationalization of all the sources that are out there. But if combined well, if rationalized well, it can work in the longer term.
Thank you very much, and let me, although we are sort of getting to very much towards the end of our time here, pick up a question that was posted more recently by a live viewer, and has gotten some support that is linked to what you were just talking about, in that it asks about the role in the Paris Agreement of the type of flexible mechanisms that are, a legacy of Kyoto, or were the mainstay of Kyoto. So, international emissions trading, clean development mechanism, the joint implementation mechanism. So these are not the type of mechanism exactly that you were just referencing, Wytze. So what role do you see in the Paris Agreement for them? And how does that compare with the Copenhagen situation? And kindly try to make this a very brief answer, and we'll ask Sebastian again also.
I think the role under the Paris Agreement will be relatively small, because those flexibility mechanisms are only useful when you have national targets, and that assumes that countries will adopt quantified emission reduction targets, which of course is still possible under in Paris, but it will be less important, I think, than it was in Copenhagen. I personally see the role of the flexibility mechanisms much more prominent for the domestic systems, such as the EU ETS, or the Chinese ETS, or the Korean ETS. So those emission trading schemes that allocate emission allowances to their domestic or regional installations, and allowing them to use the Kyoto mechanisms for doing this in a cost-effective way.
Thank you. And Sebastian, what do you think?
I think I essentially agree. If I look at the international negotiations and at the dynamics there, there's not too much talk about these kind of flexibility mechanisms at the moment. I think what we might see, what I would expect if we get a Paris Agreement, is something that's actually not too different from the type of thing that we saw in the Kyoto Protocol. And that in the Kyoto Protocol, indeed, we had these three flexibility mechanisms, but very rudimentary. And perhaps I would think that there might be something more rudimentary in the Paris Agreement on flexibility mechanisms, namely simply a statement about that they may be elaborated, and that one then later on has a process in which they would be elaborated, because it's not clear in the new climate world how they would exactly operate, between which countries, whether we are actually talking more about linking national or subnational systems, or whether we are talking about real international flexibility mechanisms. So I think that's a debate probably for post-Paris.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much to both of you. I think in terms of questions and conversation, this is what we have time for today. There seems to be a lot that's still open for negotiations in advance of Paris, and a lot of the technical detail will have to be resolved in the years that follow. I take away a lot of interesting points from the conversation today. On the one hand, it seems that Copenhagen and Paris were pursuing similar goals, but not necessarily exactly the same type of achievement. Paris sort of seems to be have a softer approach in that it doesn't angle so much towards a Kyoto-style approach, which was still dominating for Copenhagen. We also alluded to a lot of the changes in the general context, such as the bigger policy agreements, the advances in national policy, the US and China deal, and the progress with renewables that are helping to create a more favorable outcome. I think very key, obviously, is the fact that that there is a process difference in that now in advance of Paris, even though for many countries this is a very new exercise, almost all countries are preparing to put something specific on the table that will be their contribution to a future international climate regime, and that is an innovative item in the Paris architecture. At the same time, that bottom-up process will throw up some questions for answer in the future in terms of how it can actually then become a meaningful and sufficiently ambitious overall framework, but it seems important that there is a signal from Paris that there is a contribution being made to the overall process of transformation, and Paris may not be the only place indeed where this is being decided, but one of several games that are being played in parallel. I want to thank, in particular, of course, all those that have participated today live. We had over 20 viewers, and thanks also to those of you who are watching us as a recording and have made it until this very point. We appreciate your attention. A big thank you to both Sebastian and Wytze as our speakers. That was really very insightful. Thanks a lot.
Welcome.
Welcome. And I want to thank also all of the members of the expert response group that replied to our first survey. As I said earlier, the first results are going online at polimp.eu later today. A big thank you also to our POLIMP project partners. Several, I'm sure, were joining us now, and especially our colleagues at the UPRC who've managed all the invitation. And then, of course, to the Ecologic Institute colleagues that have helped put this all together and make it happen, in particular Andreas Graf, who is our online cameraman today for the setup and is master of the webinar series, and a big thank you also to Nick Evans, who's been shepherding the survey process. We will be back with the second edition of the POLIMP Webinar Series in early September. Stay tuned for further details on our website. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.